welcome everyone, and maybe one of the first things I should say, since I'm speaking behind some of you, is that most of the semester we're going to be doing things in a much more conversational way. I'm going to be standing up and talking this class period, maybe next class period, but for the most part, I'm hoping that I'm going to sit down at the table with you, and we're going to do it in a sort of conversational way. But I figure that putting stuff up on the screen is probably helpful, especially initially. If you didn't know before now, you've just discovered that I like bad puns. I had found it so useful last class period, making that word cloud, finding out what kinds of things you associate with Paul in your mind, those of you who were here. And I thought, let's try something else that this pull everywhere thing can do. And so I took a map. I didn't give you a map of the whole world because I thought that might just be too cruel. But I wonder whether you have any sense of where Paul traveled. And so what I'd like for you to do is, if you have a device with you that you can access the internet, go to holyv.com/JamesMcGrath449 and start clicking. Which places, and it's got it broken up by squares. I honestly don't know, because this is my first time using an image map like this. I don't honestly know what's going to happen when more than one person clicks in the same square. But I think it'll give you the opportunity to put the thing right on a specific spot. Right? And so there are no place names on this map. But if the place looks like someplace that you think Paul might have been, click there. And I won't be trying to get too precise because it's a small map and may have been aiming for someplace nearby. But try and get at least geographic regions that you think he'd been to represented. And this will be useful trip planning too, because we could do a Paul and a Paul trip, and go to places that. So you're hoping that they're places that are warm and sunny. But, do some clicking, then we'll see what you come up with. Well, there's some places that have been clicked that we have good reason to think that Paul went at some point. There's at least one place where I'm not aware of any information that he was there, but we'll take a close look and see. And it may have just been first attempt at clicking and the aim was off or something. But there are a number of places on that map that Paul had been that have not yet had a single click. So take a look. I don't have you logged in, so if you later on say, that was me, I was the one who clicked there, I will probably believe you. Right? So, and if I ask who clicked there, who thought that Paul had been to Northern Ireland or something, which hasn't been clicked yet, but just saying. And now no one's going to click it. But if you click someplace and it doesn't seem to turn out to be right, you can just pretend like, oh, that wasn't me. Right? So there's no risk involved in daring to try some places on there. Anyone, or are you basically done? Okay, so where are those? What are those clicks there in places that, do you know what those places are currently called that you clicked on? Sort of ones that are off to the bottom right, if you're looking from this direction, Where is that today?
Greece.
Yeah. And we do have not just records in Acts of Paul visiting places that are in Greece. We also have letters that mention his having been to Greece. They're addressed to churches that he planted in Greece. So Greece is definitely right. We'll take a close look, and if you manage to get it right on an actual city that he went to, then you'll feel pretty good about yourself. So there you go. Where else? What are some other modern day countries corresponding to places that have been clicked on there? Nobody sent him to Northern Ireland, which was correct. What's the one that looks like a boot, and it looks like somebody, at least one or two of you, were aiming for a particular place further up the leg, as it were? Heading westward from Greece, yeah.
Italy or Rome
Italy.
at the time?
Yeah, and some of you were aiming for Rome. And I'll confess I've never been to Rome, but it is also a place that Paul went to. And in fact, one of his letters to the Romans, right? One of the things we'll be talking about today are these letters, and when it says to the Romans or to the Corinthians or things like that, who are the addressees? What does that mean? So Rome is another one. To my knowledge, he never made it to Slovakia, but I think that one up at the top may have been just miscalculation of just how far Greece went. But what do we got?
It's a spider. I got it. We're good. Try not to harm it, but if you yeah, I think it's stomped on it. For sure.
Yeah, its relatives may still be in your bag. For
Yeah.
Okay. Did Paul have any run-ins with spiders? Any stories about that? No. Okay. He probably did, but none of them were worth mentioning. What other places do you know of that you think Paul went to? Whether or not you think I clicked on there or not, right? But do you know anything about any other places that he went to? Well, let's start with the question of Paul. What was his name even? And given that there were no family names in this period, what was he known as? Because one of the names that he went by gives us geographical information. That was often very commonly the case in the ancient world. What do we know in terms of other names and/or places?
Saul of Tarsus.
Of Tarsus, yeah. And we find him using two different proper names, Saul as well as Paul, and that sometimes is thought to be connected with a change of name, like Peter. It's a nickname, actually means basically rocky, right? For an individual named Simon. Other nicknames that Jesus gave to people, and so some have thought that was a nickname that indicated his new Christian perspective on things. But in all likelihood, it may just be that Saul was a Jewish name, and that was the name that he used in a Hebrew or Aramaic-speaking context. And when he was in the Greek-speaking world, he used something that was similar, both in meaning and sound, and that there he used Paulus. And he was known as Saul or Paul of Tarsus. Where's Tarsus? Can anyone know even vaguely? I could give you region of Cilicia, but that probably won't tell you anything. Yeah.
So was that Sicily?
No.
Or anything?
No. It sounds like
Yeah.
it.
Somewhere east of Greece.
Well, where's right east of Greece that might be a place to start looking? Anyone know what that landmass is? That used to be called Asia Minor.
Turkey?
Yeah, today it's Turkey. And we know of visits by Paul to places in Turkey. And there's actually a mention of visit to the region of Cilicia in one of his letters. Right? And in his letters, which are our primary sources, Paul doesn't mention being from Tarsus. Right? He doesn't introduce himself as Saul of Tarsus or even Paul of Tarsus. But he does mention going to that part of the world. And it wasn't a major either travel destination or route that one would necessarily naturally take to go to the places that we know Paul went. And so the fact that he went there may have an indication, may give us an indication that he did actually have some kind of family connection with that part of the world, right? So there were a number of places over here that could have been clicked on. Where else? Anyone know of other stories of Paul going places other than in Greece or Italy? What about Jerusalem? Does he ever get to Jerusalem as far as you know? We're going to read some accounts of his own about that. There's also stories in Acts. And so down here, right, in what is modern day Israel, right, could have had some clicks there as well. So moving eastward, there are a few places that could have been included. And I'll bring up a map that actually shows some of his routes so that we can get a sense of precisely where he went. What about westward? Paul go anywhere westward? I mean, let's face it, I mean, if you get to Greece and Rome, I mean, why would you want to go anywhere else, right? They're warm and sunny most of the time. We don't have any evidence that the economy was as bad in Greece then as it is today. But where else did Paul go? Anyone aware of any place west of that we haven't clicked yet? And again, this is just getting a sense of what you already know or associate with Paul, and then obviously I'm going to be giving you information, so don't worry if you're not getting the. We have mentioned in his letter to the Romans that he wanted to travel from there and use Rome as a base of operation to carry out activity further westward, going as far as Spain. And there are some church traditions which suggest that he actually managed to do it. We don't have that from his letters, right? And we don't have that recorded in Acts. And so we'll talk about those plans, but we won't be talking about things that we don't actually have, solid evidence for. One of the things we'll talk about, though, is how this activity of his, right? Because he wasn't just like a passionate sightseer, right? He's going to these places with particular reasons. And as we explore the geography of his travels, and we think about what his longer-term plans might have been, it may help us to think about what he thought his role in history was. Okay, so thanks for playing along with that and doing the "Where's Paul" though thing. I know that pun is groan-worthy, but some of you actually smiled. And so, I actually put a couple of maps up on my blog, which I found useful, and no point in bringing them from there. But a site called Vox, which circulates images and news and things like that, recently had a set of 40 maps that explain the Roman Empire. And I thought that a few of these were worth sharing. Right? And so the first one is this one, right? Which looks like a bunch of blue squiggles on the United States, which probably you're thinking, somebody didn't like the United States and just took the map and blue crayon and messed it up or something. But if you look closely, you might actually notice that some of those squiggles resemble something you're just looking at. Pop-up messages, we don't need that. And so can you see that that's actually supposed to be at the bottom, the north of Africa, and on top we've got Spain and Italy and England up there, off that way. And you can see here Rome. So not trying to suggest that Rome was somewhere between Colorado and Nebraska, that's not the point. The point is to give you a sense of the size of the Roman Empire. Right? And at its furthest extent, right, it actually was essentially comparable in size to the United States. And considering that modern military technology, modern travel technology didn't exist then, right, this is quite a large geographic area. And Paul seems to have had as his goal to proclaim the Christian message throughout this region. Right? And so that's quite an undertaking that he's trying to accomplish. This one is one that gives some distances in terms of travel time. Right? And so as you can see from these ones that are the darkest colored routes, right? Whether by sea, by land, by some combination of the two, distance from Rome. So some of these places took you about 4 weeks to get there using the methods of transportation that were available, which included ship, included horses and donkeys. But a lot of times people couldn't afford horses, donkeys, ship fare. And so people walked a lot more than they do today. Right? And so Paul, in trying to get around these places, right, again, was a more significant undertaking than if you try to get to Colorado from Florida or something like that. So to get from Jerusalem, let's say, to Rome, right, is like getting from South Carolina to Nebraska without motors, much less flight. Right? So, has anyone here ever tried walking that or doing it by horse? I'm guessing no, but you never know. I've had students who have really interesting stories, and so I always want to give you the chance to throw those in. Right? So, when it comes to Paul's travels, right, you can type that in, and there are lots and lots of maps that include some of his journeys. Right? You'll often find them listed as Paul's first, second, and third missionary journey, and that sort of thing. Paul wouldn't have thought of them in those terms, right? He didn't say, okay, now we're on to missionary journey number 2. Right? We'll read in some of his letters that he tried to get places, and sometimes it wasn't possible for a variety of reasons. And in some cases, we know what those reasons were, and so can talk about them. There's Tarsus. Here's Jerusalem down here. Right? Antioch, right, is another place that was significant in Paul's activity. That's where he spent a significant amount of time and first left from there to carry out his activities proclaiming the gospel in various places. And for those of you who weren't here last time, one of the things I suggested as a possible thing for you to do is to take a look at some of the resources that are out there and do reading about Paul. And as the two coincide, and as you discover that while there are some maps that are useful, some maybe are too confusing, maybe there's a better way of doing this now, maybe it would be easier to do this in a video, right, where you show the route, and then you take that one away and then show the other one, and then maybe bring them all together at the end. Right? Making those kinds of useful online resources would show me that you've understood things about Paul, right? Will also be one of the many ways you can earn points for this course, right? So, Paul's living in the time of the Roman Empire, right? And we've got that he's from this place called Tarsus. What else do we need to know about Paul in order to really get started? Right? And one of the challenges, of course, is that we're asking about the person who wrote the letters that we're going to spend the semester studying. And there are primary sources. Right? So it would make a lot more sense to read the letters and then ask, okay, now that we finish reading all these things that come from Paul, what do we know about him? But if we just jump in, we're going to be at a serious disadvantage. Right? Because when people receive these letters, he wasn't writing them out of the blue. In almost every case, right, and certainly all the letters that are universally agreed to be authentic are written to churches, right, to Christian groups, even though they didn't have that name at the time, right, but what we would call Christian groups, Christian communities in various parts of the world. Right? And so one point to take away from this class is that when you read Paul's letter to the Romans, he's not writing a blanket letter to everyone who considered themselves a Roman or everyone who lived in Rome, right? These are letters to Christian communities in Rome or in Corinth or in these various places, right? There are some things that we need to know about Paul in order to be able to make sense of his letters, right? Because he emphasizes stuff, he assumes stuff, he takes stuff for granted, right? And in some cases, we actually, to quote a phrase that was popularized recently, we sometimes know what we don't know. Sometimes there are known unknowns, and sometimes there are unknown known, and there's all that kind of confusing stuff. But there are some cases where we actually know that there are things we don't know. Right? Paul, in his letter, his first letter to the Corinthians, right, or the one that we call 1 Corinthians, right, start of chapter 7, right, says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote," and the next phrase is, "It's well for a man not to touch a woman." That'll reinforce some stereotypes that some of you have in Paul. We'll get back to that when we get into Corinthians. But the key thing to note is that sometimes Paul was responding to letters from them, right, in his letter writing. And so he's specifically addressing not just concerns that he's heard about, although in some cases he's doing that as well, but things that they've written to him about. Do we have any letters to Paul from the Corinthians? That's exactly right, we don't. I hope you like it when I interpret your silence as a correct answer. Yeah, good? Okay. I'll try and do that as often as I can. But not too often, because then you'll think, well, it's worth being silent just in case it's going to be one of those cases, right? If we had those letters, there'd be all kinds of things that we could figure out, right? Why on earth would someone tell people it's good not to touch a woman? Right? What could have possibly motivated him to write that to these people? Right? Something in the letter that they wrote. But is that a quote from them? And does Paul completely agree with it? Is that a quote from them quoting him? Is he correcting how they'd understood? What's going on there? Because we don't have their letters, we're doing the equivalent of listening in on one end of a phone conversation. And you've probably all done that. I'm not talking about those cases where you actually take a glass and put it up to the door and listen, when you're not supposed to, right? But sometimes you're in a room and somebody calls and the person answers the phone. "Oh, hi. Oh, yeah, she's here too. Oh, sure, we'd love to." And you're like, you're trying to figure out what's going on and what you're getting yourself into. As the conversation progresses, even though you can only hear one side, sometimes you can figure out who it is that they're talking to and what it is they're talking about. And we're forced to do much the same thing with Paul's letters, right? The other thing we're doing, right? I think the copyright and all that kind of stuff is passed, and it's not the same postal system. But we're doing something which today would be a federal offense, right? We're reading someone else's mail. Right? Okay, I'm kind of kidding, but we are reading someone else's mail, right? This is, a corpus of letters that were written to other people, right? And so we don't have the advantage of knowing what was going on in this place. I mean, without research, we won't even know generally what was going on, right? What were the cultural values? What were some of these broad assumptions that Paul and his readers shared? But clearly, Paul and his readers shared some very specific assumptions. And because these are Christian communities, one of the things that we'll see is that Paul doesn't introduce them to the basics of the Christian faith. He'll quote some things that apparently were widely known when he feels he needs to make a point about them and to reinforce them. But a lot of details which you get, for instance, reading the Gospels, right? Stories about Jesus, those kinds of details about what he said, what he did, what he taught, are not there in Paul's letters. Right? And so there's a good reason why we need to do at least some introductory work first, because unless we can figure out some things about this guy who wrote these letters and bring some of them together first and keep them in mind, between not knowing the author yet and not knowing the recipients and not knowing the culture, a lot of this stuff may not make sense. I mean, if you've ever read somebody else's mail, I'm looking around for knowing looks, but none of you have that sort of guilty look I expect on your face, so good for you for not tampering with your roommate's mail. But if you were, by accident, sometime, to happen across somebody else's letter and to read it, you might find that there are references to things which the two people were communicating about, and you simply aren't sure what it is they were talking about, right? There's background, there's assumption, right? And so that's why we're going to spend some time talking about things that might best be left till the end, right? Because we'll understand Paul better, and we can draw conclusions about Paul better once we've read his letters. We don't have that luxury in a sense. And so I'm going to try and get some details gleaned from his letters, as well as bringing Acts into the picture, in order to do a basic overview. Right? So Saul, also known as Paul, from Tarsus. What do we know about his upbringing? What do we know about his religious background? By the time we have him writing letters, he is what we'd call a Christian. But as we saw last time, that's a term that wasn't widely used yet, at least, and we don't find it in his letters. But we get a very strong sense that he has this sense of calling from and association with this person that he refers to as Jesus Christ or Jesus the Messiah. If we go back earlier, do you know anything about that? Was Paul always connected with this movement that later comes to be called Christianity? I see some very, very hesitant nods in the sort of no sort of direction. That's correct. Now that you know you're correct, do you want to shake your head a little more vigorously and say what you think you know? Or, yeah.
Wasn't he a Jew?
Yeah. And one of the things that we'll want to ask is, when we encounter him as what we call a Christian, is he still a Jew? Is he still Jewish? Would he still have considered himself Jewish? And that's a more important question than you might probably realize. But his background, right, is in Judaism.
He also persecuted Christians.
And he persecuted Christians. So before he was a proponent of this faith that we call Christianity, and I'm going to stop saying over and over again that which we call and communities which, with hindsight, I'm throwing in all those qualifiers because I think you got it, right? The terminology is not used yet. But we're going to use, like 1/10 of our class time just using those long phrases if, we keep doing it. So I'm going to talk about Christians. I'm going to talk about Paul as a Christian, even though the term is anachronistic, but I don't think Paul would have minded, right? It's not that he seems to have been against the term, it's just one which becomes first probably a nickname given by others. Oh, those people are always talking about Jesus, this Christ, so what do we call them? Oh, those Christ one, Christians. Right? But it sticks and it becomes the name of the religion, what they used. Right? Christianity itself starts as a movement within Judaism. Jesus himself is a Jew. The people who first believed in him were Jews. And the entire movement initially was a Jewish phenomenon, right? It's what we might call a form of Messianic Judaism, right? Judaism which believes that the Messiah has arrived. And so one of the questions we'll want to ask is, right, at one point he's an opponent, and then he comes to be a proponent. Is what happens in between that turns him from the one to the other, should we call that a conversion? We'll put that on hold for a second though. Do we know anything more specific about his Jewish background? Because if you know anything about Judaism, and of course I'm not assuming that you do, but if you do know anything about Judaism in our time, you'll know that there are a range of different ways of being Jewish, just like there are a range of different ways of being Christian, right? You go into your average Baptist church, right? And you probably won't encounter incense, which you might in Russian Orthodox church. There are differences within Judaism in our time, and not too surprisingly, if you trace the lines back, there were different sorts of differences then than now, but there were differences then too. Do we know anything more specific about any kind of group that he was a part of? He actually mentions, right, at one point, in listing his achievements, right, in his Jewish past, that he was a Pharisee. And that's a term which we need to clarify, because if you use that term at all, other than simply in reading Bible stories or something like that, what connotations does Pharisee have today? Have any of you ever used it as an insult? Launched it at someone else? Ever had somebody call you a Pharisee? Well, good. Maybe we're getting away from using it as an insult, right? But because of some of the things that are said about Pharisees in the Bible, and particularly in the New Testament, should say, because a movement that starts after the Hebrew Bible is formed, so it's not mentioned there. But in the New Testament, right, we have Jesus depicted as criticizing the Pharisees and arguing with them and calling them hypocrites. And so people will sometimes call someone a Pharisee. And if you're curious, you can get a sense of that by looking up what you get if you ordered a Pharisee if you were in Vienna. Those of you who are Googling, let's get you Googling stuff that's relevant. But something you might order there. But a Pharisee, right, then does not mean a hypocrite, right? Whatever the term comes to mean in English in subsequent times. Right? The Pharisees were one of several sects or subgroupings, or maybe you prefer to call them denominations, if that's a more meaningful term to you. Right? Groups within Judaism, which had a particular slant on things, an angle on it, much as Christians did, right? They were a Jewish group that had a particular slant on things. And we won't go into a lot of detail because this is not the place for it. I go into a little more detail in my course on the Bible for those who are interested, and of course you can look up articles on the Pharisees. One thing you might like to do some research on is Paul's background, right, prior to his connection with Christianity. But the Pharisees were known for their rigor, right, and their concern with the interpretation of the law and finding ways to interpret the law faithfully, right? Which doesn't mean necessarily strict legalism or things like that. Right? That's often what you think of when you think of somebody being rigorous with the interpretation of the law. Right? But again, that has resulted in a lot of caricatures which are unhelpful. Right? If you think about somebody today, let's say who is a Supreme Court justice and who was concerned to be rigorously faithful in their interpretation of the law, you wouldn't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It could be a bad thing, right? And I'm sure there are Supreme Court justices whose approach to being faithful in their interpretation of the law you like more than others. And let's not get sidetracked on that now. But there's a sense in which that's the best sort of modern analogy I can give you to the role of the Pharisees. Right? A central component of the Jewish scriptures is what's known as the Torah, right? The first 5 books of the Bible. And a substantial component of that are a set of laws. Right? And the most famous are the 10 Commandments, but there are a lot of others. And the question of how to apply those laws, right, was one that people have been wrestling with for a long time. And so one of the things that the Pharisees were famous for was an oral tradition, which was basically case precedent. Like we might talk of today. If the Supreme Court is going to decide on a case, they're not just going to look at what's the law and then interpret. They're also going to look at how has that law been interpreted and applied by other legal experts in the past. And so the Pharisees, and in particular scribes who were associated with the Pharisees, were concerned with that. And while they were rigorous, right, their rigor and their attention to detail wasn't always either legalistic or harsh. Right? For instance, when they could find a loophole that would get somebody off the death penalty, they used it because they thought that death penalty should only be used in extreme circumstances. And there were laws that required that you stone to death a disobedient son. And I'm guessing that a lot of us here today, if that law were in effect, we might not be here today, right? So we can probably appreciate those who find loopholes for that sort of thing. But the law mentioned that if there's a son who doesn't hearken to their voice and doesn't come swiftly when they call, things like that. And so they said, okay, well, if he has any kind of walking impediment, if he has any kind of hearing impediment, right, then they found loopholes. And in some cases, in the interest of being faithful to the wording while also being merciful. And there were other loopholes which they found, right? And so the rigor is not just about legalism or harshness. Right? It's about attention to detail and trying to figure out the best way to be faithful to this body of laws in their time. Right? And oftentimes there was a concern for very, very rigorous application of rules, for instance, about purity and things like that. And I mention this because one of the questions that you're going to have is, okay, so why would somebody like Paul have persecuted the early Christian movement? Right? And Paul doesn't actually say. Right? He does talk about this aspect of his past with regret, but he doesn't spell out what probably to his readers was obvious. Why would this particular guy associated with the Pharisees have persecuted Christians? And so that's one of the things that we need to actually try and figure out. And one possibility is that, as we see in the teaching of Jesus, right, when he got in arguments with the Pharisees, his approach to interpreting law is rather different. While the Pharisees said that if you have somebody who is in a life-threatening situation, right, and you have to break the Sabbath to rescue them, then you do it, right? Because saving life is something that you're commanded to do, right? Caring for others is something you're commanded to do in the law. The Sabbath is something you're supposed to do. When the two conflict, what do you do? Right? But we also have stories about them criticizing Jesus for healing on the Sabbath when it wasn't a life-threatening case, and it was something which could have been done any day of the week, right? And so why do this today? One of the things that Paul will become famous for is arguing that non-Jews could be incorporated into this movement and become part of the people of God. And that, too, might have been an issue. And if so, then, not surprisingly, when Paul becomes persuaded that Jesus is the Messiah and that these Christians are, in fact, right, what he does is he proclaims that message and becomes the strongest advocate for that viewpoint. Should we call his turnaround a conversion? I don't know whether anyone here has ever converted from one religion to another or is thinking about doing so. No need to get personal if you don't want to share those details. It's only the second day of class. But when you hear about religious conversion, I mean, what would that mean? When might you apply that? If somebody converted from what to what, would you say, talk about in terms of conversion?
I converted from being a Lutheran to Catholic, so I don't know that.
Yeah, maybe. So Lutheran to Catholic. I mean, I think that if somebody is Christian and they become a Buddhist, we'd say they convert, right? Lutheran to Catholic. Interesting. Yeah.
What if somebody went from having no religion to joining later in life?
Maybe.
Would that be?
Yeah, might be an example of conversion. If you go to a Methodist church, and then you go to campus and there isn't one that you like, so you go to a non-denominational church or something like that, do you think of yourself as having converted? Probably not, right? Lutheran to Catholic is an interesting one, and there you might use it, not least because of reasons that Paul is actually connected with. Right? If there's a big difference between Lutherans and Catholics, it's not the form of the liturgy in most of its details or anything like that. It's about a particular way that Paul's letters are understood. And so we'll be talking about that on another occasion. Grew up Southern Baptist and then started going to an American Baptist church. That divide can be pretty extreme if you are familiar with those traditions. But we might not think of it in terms of a conversion. Right? And so I bring this up because it's quite common, and you'll encounter it in the literature, it's quite common for people to talk about Paul's conversion to Christianity. And this is connected with the point that was made earlier, which is that Paul was Jewish. And when he talks about this background, one of the things we'll see is that he doesn't talk about it as though he's abandoned Judaism for something else. Because in fact, Christianity in this period was not something else, in quotes. Right? It was one of the ways of being Jewish. And so if you'd be happy talking about somebody who goes from being a Sadducee to being a Pharisee, or goes from being a Pharisee to being an Essene, another Jewish group from this period, from being a Pharisee to being a Christian, moving from one Jewish sect to another as conversion, then by all means use that term. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind to avoid anachronism is that in this period, when Paul is writing, Christianity is a movement within Judaism. thanks at least in part to Paul's efforts, it's a movement within Judaism which has begun to welcome non-Jews. Right? And so we're at a decisive moment which eventually leads to the situation that we are in today, which is Christianity is basically considered a separate world religion from Judaism. And while there are some places of overlap, right, there are Jewish Christians in our time, for the most part, Judaism and Christianity are largely non-overlapping circles in our time. And so we need to get ourselves thinking consciously about the difference between our time and Paul's time if we're not to misunderstand his letters. And we'll see him using the famous image towards the end of his letter to the Romans, in which he talks about the people of Israel, and it's the image of an olive tree, and talks about branches being grafted in. And so he views Gentiles, right, non-Jews, who become part of Christianity, as we call it, as being grafted into that historic people. And these are things which, when we look at the details of Paul's letters, right, we're not going to try and resolve all the details of interpreting the places where these things come up in his letters today. But we're going to introduce this as well as some of the other issues we've talked about, because some of these issues actually have had real-life consequences. When Christians have viewed Jews as those who opposed the Messiah and as something not just separate from, but opposed to Christianity, have seen Paul's talk about branches being grafted in and branches being broken off and things like that. It has sometimes been part of a worldview that has fostered anti-Semitism and things like that. And so we want to think carefully about these things. And well, we need to have one eye on our own situation and be aware of the things that are shaping the questions we're asking the text. It's also important to have another perspective in which we're trying at least consciously to be aware when the issues in Paul's time were very different than our own. So, how does Paul introduce himself in his letters? If he doesn't call himself Saul or Paul of Tarsus, that's not the main thing that he said. Anybody know what word he tends to use when introducing himself in his letters? Very often it's Paul and apostle. That's what you'll usually find in English. And if you open at random to just about any of Paul's letters, right, you'll find that oftentimes the opening words are Paul and apostle. And I mentioned last time that apostle is a transliterated word, right? It's just taking a Greek word and moving the sounds into English. Does anyone know what apostle meant in Greek? Greek word apostolos. With the verb apostello, which means to send. And so apostolos means one who is sent. And probably the closest term that we might have today, although we don't use it a lot, to be honest, is emissary. And so not just someone who's sent, but someone who's sent as a representative of someone else. And so we'll see Paul arguing about this term and his sense of calling in his letters. In his letter to the Galatians, he says, Paul, an apostle, and it says, not sent by any human being, right? Not by human authority, but by God and by Jesus. And so, while there were emissaries sent out by churches, sometimes with a very narrow scope, right, to deliver assistance to another church, sometimes with the aim of proclaiming the Christian message where it had not yet been heard. Paul emphasizes that he's in fact an apostle in the sense in which people like Peter and James and John, the circle of the 12, were apostles, people who had been sent out by Jesus. And so he basically argues that his authority, even though he wasn't part of that circle of the 12 during Jesus' pre-crucifixion activity, he's nonetheless one who has been called directly by Jesus and sent out by him. And so apostolos, emissary, right? Someone who's sent out with authority. And we might even say, another term that might be a close equivalent is missionary. Right? Someone who's sent out to proclaim a message, to bring new churches into existence. there's only so much that we can go into today, so I'm going to try and keep things short. There are some big issues, right? We've had the whole Catholic versus Lutheran thing come up, at least in passing mention. But it's one of the big things connected with the interpretation of Paul's letters and of his letters to the Galatians and to the Romans in particular. And so we'll save some of those issues for that occasion. For today, right, I want us to get a sense of who this person is and what we need to know so we can dive into his letters. And the next time we'll continue a little bit of this, but hopefully also make a first start at interpreting the earliest of his letters. But one of the things we'll focus on next time is figuring out which are the earliest of his letters. What order should we work through them in? And while we could go through them in any order, and the arrangement in the New Testament, basically kind of like size order, right? They put the bigger ones towards the front, right? The meatier or weightier ones. Right? If we read them in the order in which Paul wrote them, then if there's development in his thought over the years, we're more likely to pick up on that. Right? And so we'll be trying to do that. And so there's actually some reading on Moodle for next time related to what we might call the subject of Pauline chronology. Right? Can we outline his life? Can we do so using his letters? Can we do so using his letters and Acts? Acts gives us a story about Paul, which would be immensely helpful, but is it trustworthy? Does it give us insight into Paul? Did the author actually know about these things? And those are the kinds of questions that historians have to ask when using a source like that. And so we'll focus on some of those things next time. Among the things that we find in Acts, but not in Paul's letters, the story about the Damascus Road experience. And some of you, right, if you've ever, converted, and here it's right, a case where you definitely would talk about conversion, right? If you grew up only liking country music, and then you started liking rap, it's like a conversion. No? The other way around? Okay. Didn't pick the right genres to my knowledge. Should have stuck with the ones that I know. I'm more of a rock person myself. Anyway, if you've ever had someone talk about, a Damascus Road experience, or it's like there was no light from heaven or things like that, right? The story of Paul's conversion, if we want to call it that, as it's told in Acts, has Jesus appearing to him in a flash of light from the sky when he's on the Damascus Road, right? He's on his way to continue harassing Christians and persecuting Christians. We don't have that story in his letters. And so next time, one of the things that we'll focus on is, when we have things in Acts that are not in his letters, what do we do? And we'll look at some specific examples and see, can we get the things to match up? Do they fit together? Those kinds of things. Paul was born in Tarsus. There's been some debate about where he grew up. We encounter him in the book of Acts living in Jerusalem. And there he's actually depicted as having studied with a famous rabbi named Gamaliel. That's another detail that we can talk about. But whatever one's view on that subject, he seems to have had some serious, what we might call rabbinic training. And so he's a bilingual Jew, right? His ancestry, his background, right? He's of Jewish descent, but a Greek-speaking Jew, right? And Greek was what we call the lingua franca at this time, right? So the language that was used by people in different parts of the world who didn't all speak the same language as their mother tongue, right? In fact, I remember going to a conference, and there was somebody from South Africa who was going to be presenting, and he circulated a copy of his paper beforehand, but he had an updated one, and he apologized for the fact that there were linguistic issues in it. He said, but I come from a country where we only have one language, we have lots and lots of different languages spoken, and only one language that we all have in common, which is bad English. And it got a chuckle, but it gives a good example of, Paul writes decent Greek. He's fluent in the language, right? He was brought up speaking it, right? It's native language. Apparently he also seems to have known Hebrew and Aramaic. And so that linguistic aspect of Paul's person actually symbolizes something of his role. He's someone who ends up sort of straddling two cultures, potentially, right? And certainly two linguistic groups. Right? He's taking something that is born, right, this movement that's centered around Jesus, in an Aramaic linguistic environment, and proclaiming it to people who don't know Aramaic. Occasionally he throws in Aramaic words, right? And so he's familiar with traditions about Jesus in another language. One thing that characterizes early Christianity that is different from, say, Islam as we know it today, is that from very early on, Christians seem to have made the decision to proclaim their message in the languages that people understood. And so, while we do get occasional words attributed to Jesus in Aramaic, occasional phrases, for the most part, right, the New Testament is in Greek. The Old New Testament is in Greek. And so, there was no concern that anyone seems to have had to say, we've got to keep Jesus' exact words, right, as he spoke them. Translating them was not only okay, but helped other people sort of encounter the message. In other religious traditions, sometimes the words that are considered important are viewed as untranslatable. And so you can have a paraphrase of them, clarify them, but ultimately you keep them in the original language. Most of the life of Paul, he's visiting parts of the world, he's proclaiming his message. According to Acts, right, he generally tended to go to the synagogue first and speak to people there. He certainly does seem to have continued to have a close connection with Jewish communities. And what I'd like for us to talk about in the remaining 15 or 20 minutes are aspects of Paul as traveler and Paul as letter writer. Right? Those were two of the big things that were featured in the word cloud that you came up with last time. Right? He wrote letters and he traveled. And in fact, those two things are not unconnected. Imagine you're Paul. You've gotten a letter from the church in Corinth. And oh man, what's going on there? And so you decide to write to them, right? So you start by, well, what do you do? Today you pick up a pen and paper, really. Actually, pick up your laptop and you write an email, right? It would be there, immediately. Going back a few years before email, right? You'd get a pen and some paper. What do you do as a letter writer in the ancient world? How is it different? One of the things that is very different from our own world is the fact that writing was a fairly specialized skill. Right? There were plenty of people who could read, but didn't write. Not because they couldn't, right? Actually, scribble out things. But did anyone here ever actually use a quill or some other kind of ancient pen and try to write on papyrus or vellum or something like that? I'm not asking as a joke. I know I have a weird sense of humor, but I'm asking because sometimes you take a class trip to a museum and they actually will introduce you to something like that. I wish I had a supply of papyrus and quills and stuff like that. Bring them in. This would be a cool way to fun activity in class. I'd give you some points. If you try to write a letter in the way that somebody writing a letter in Paul's time had to write, you get the materials and do it, maybe video yourself doing it. That would be a good activity to earn some points in this class. If we turn to the end of Paul's letter to the Romans, and of course we're fast forwarding very far, but just want to note this one thing, right? At the end of what we call Paul's letter to the Romans, right? Verse 22 of chapter 16, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter, greet you in the Lord. Who do you think this Tertius was? If this is Paul's letter to the Romans. What do you think his role in it was?
Was he just a scribe?
He was a scribe, yeah. If you wanted to compose a letter, you would be the author, but you probably would not be the writer. And most authors in the ancient world used scribes, right? People who had the professional training to write using the materials that you needed to use in order to write them. So one of the things to note is that letter writing itself is something that involves more than one person, even when it comes to the putting of pen to paper. So we need to envisage Paul dictating a letter to a person. Let's fast forward a little bit. The letter's done. Right? You've written it, and you'll notice that Paul's letters don't do things necessarily in the order that you're used to. Right? It starts with Paul, right? And there have been people who've assumed that these are letters to Paul, right? Because when you're writing someone, you start with Dear Paul. Right? When you get a letter, though, what's the first thing you do if there was no return address on the outside? Right? You turn it over to see who it's from. Right? So ancient Greek letter writing, they saved you having to do that. They wrote the sender first, then the recipient, right? And then there were greetings, and we'll talk about some of those things either before the end of class today, but more likely next time. Right? But Paul's letters generally feature a lot of the things that you'd expect in an ancient letter. Right? So it starts with the sender, and sometimes it's Paul plus other people. Right? So he wasn't always the only person who was sending the letter. And the question of whether other people had an input is worth asking. The recipients are indicated. As we saw, or as we thought about earlier, these are Christian communities in various places that he's writing to. Right? Greetings, grace and peace to you, right, from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, tends to follow, something like that. Some thanksgivings, the main body, some final greetings, things like that. You've written the letter, right? Or Tertius has written the letter, which you dictated to. What do you do next? Get an envelope and some stamps and stick it in the mailbox. Did they have mailboxes back then? How do you send a letter in the ancient Roman world? You actually need to find someone to deliver it. And that's one of the things that we also need to think about, right, when we read Paul's letters, because sending a letter then as now is a substitute for an individual being present. But then, unlike now, the person who writes the letter, or authors the letter, I should say, has to find someone to deliver it to the destination. And so one major difference is that oftentimes a letter was sent less to communicate words from the sender and more to authorize the person who would bring it, right? And who would basically represent that person in that place. And so when we get to Paul's letter to the Romans, which sometimes is viewed as the closest thing to a systematic presentation of Paul's thought, right? At least that's the way it's sometimes viewed. We'll discuss whether that's the right way to view it when we get to it. But one of the reasons he's sending that letter, apparently, is to commend this Christian leader from another community, right, who is bringing the letter, to go there and hopefully prepare the way for Paul to come there and use Rome as a base of operations so that he can carry out activity further westward. And so the fact that there's no postal system and that individuals whom Paul sent, or in some cases individuals that had come to Paul from a particular place and are then returning, right, are involved in this letter sending process, that's part of what we need to think about as well. Right? Because before Paul, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, talks about things that they wrote to him about, he says that he's heard some things. Right? And so clearly, in addition to the church in Corinth writing to Paul, asking some questions, the people who delivered the Corinthians letter to Paul told him about some stuff that they didn't want mentioned in the letter, right? Or at least that's the impression that we get. And so some of the details of why Paul talks about certain things, and then moves on to now about the things which he wrote to me about, make more sense when we're aware that people from Corinth had come with a letter to him. And in fact, what we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians may have been 2nd and 4th Corinthians. It's possible that Paul had previously written to them right? It's been debated whether a letter that's referred to in 2 Corinthians is 1 Corinthians or another letter that we don't have. Right? And so there was some exchange of letters here. And just being aware of some of the processes that were involved in sending letters is sometimes helpful as we try to make sense of them. And we'll see at least one moment where it seems as though Paul, right, was very adamant about something, and the person who had come from that church and was there with him may have actually jogged his memory. We'll see that when we get there. I think those are the main things I want to cover for today, but I do want to say, I'll leave a couple moments for questions, but let me point ahead to next time, just in case we run out of time. One of the things that we'll do next time, right, there'll be some specific reading. I thought Labor Day weekend, second day of class, break it gently, go ahead. But we'll have some reading for next time, which, again, it's probably going to be hard for you to do much with it or to get a real profound sense of some of the issues, right? Trying to figure out how Paul's letter should be fit together into a chronology of his life, and whether we can outline his life, and whether we should use Acts or not. All of that, again, is better done after detailed study of the letters. But because we need an outline for this course, in fact, I've tried to take at least the consensus view in outlining the course on the syllabus, right? So there's a bit of a spoiler alert there, right? But you need to be aware that, whereas if you study these things, let's say in the high school level, you might have just looked up and said, this letter was written first because it was written in the year such and such, right? In an upper level university course, you need to be aware that the deduction about when it was written, right, is a deduction, right? None of these letters are dated. Paul doesn't say either, 54, January 3rd, 54 AD or CE or something like that. He doesn't even say, in the such and such year of Claudius or something like that, right? You don't have those there are no kinds of dates on there. And so when historians say this was probably written in this year, they're taking them like pieces of a puzzle and trying to fit them together. Right? And while I'm not going to expect you to try and engage in that, I do want you to understand that so that you're aware where there are some instances when it may be that what we think was the first letter maybe wasn't the first. And we'll talk about some of the issues. If this is the first letter, if that was the first letter, does it matter? Does it give us a different impression about Paul, what was important to him, and those kinds of things? When we get to Galatians, we'll talk then about something which didn't appear in the word cloud, but which really is associated with Paul in a lot of people's minds. The importance of grace and faith over against what he calls works of the law. Right? And the impact of those terms, as Paul uses them, on particular individuals in history, from Augustine to Martin Luther at the time of the Reformation, has shaped the way people think about those letters. And so we'll be talking about some of those influences on contemporary interpretation, as well as trying to get back behind them to ask, are we understanding these letters the right way if we read them in that way? Or should we be putting them back into an ancient Jewish context, and if so, how is that different? When does Paul die, and how does Paul die? Pretty much everything in between ceasing persecuting Christians and the end of his life, as far as we know anything about it, seems to have been dedicated to that which we get the impression his life was dedicated to, whether we were reading his letters or Acts, right? Proclaiming the Christian message around the Roman Empire. Anyone know anything about his death?
Isn't it not mentioned in the Bible?
It's not mentioned in the Bible, that's correct. And all of you who were staying quiet were saying the same thing, right, for your silence, which was good. So everyone got that one, that was pretty good. There are traditions, though, that suggest that after Paul ends up in Rome as a prisoner, right, that's the situation that's depicted at the end of the Acts of the Apostles, that he was released, that he eventually did go to Spain, and then is re-imprisoned later in the time of Nero, and is executed then. But as far as the biblical information, and as far as our early sources are concerned, we don't actually have that, information. And so as far as we know, when he got to Rome, he may have stayed there either until the time of Nero, or he may have been executed earlier. Right? We're not given the verdict, sort of for his trial in Rome. And so there's a sense in which the story sort of peters out when we're talking about clear-cut historical information about Paul. If you're interested in the church's traditions about Paul and his martyrdom, you probably, being very busy students, don't want to have to read a book about the subject, much less a long one. And so what I'd recommend is to check out the movie Quo Vadis. Has anyone here even heard of that movie? Reasonable chance you may not have. But it's a Latin phrase which is connected with the martyrdom of Peter, in church tradition. But it features Peter Ustinov playing the seemingly unhinged Nero and doing a great job of it. And it basically is telling the traditional church story about the persecution at the time of Nero and the fire in Rome and things of that sort. And so if you're interested in finding out how the story ends according to church tradition, you don't need to necessarily read a book. Obviously, you could just Google it, but if you're in the mood for a movie night, this is a classic which you might find interesting. We're going to go into more details about Paul's letters, about his view of things. One thing to mention again that I said last time is that sometimes things which only appear infrequently, right, or seem to be just beneath the surface, may be central to Paul, but not central to the reason why he was writing the letter to that particular group. Okay? And so, for instance, in these letters, he doesn't proclaim the message that he proclaimed to churches, or to create churches, as it were, and to persuade people to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And so, another thing we're going to do next time, in addition to thinking about the chronology, is to look at that aspect of what's behind the letters. Right? Can we figure out what Paul proclaimed? What was his message? If you've flipped channels or walked on streets where there are street preachers or been to churches or done any of that, then you'll not only know that there are, you'll probably know that there are different ways that people have of proclaiming what they understand the gospel to be. And sometimes not only the method of delivery, but the content differs. And so it's not self-evident that, Paul, for instance, went around passing out tracts that say 4 things God wants you to know, or something like that. In fact, chances are he didn't, because passing around tracts was not an effective method when you had to make the tracts by hand, right? And hire a scribe. You may have had to pay the guy as well, unless he was fellow Christian was willing to give of his services for that. What did he proclaim? How did he proclaim? Where did he proclaim it? Right? Those are some of the things we want to figure out. So we can get a sense of what some of his core beliefs were that seem to be below the surface. Right? One of the things that he focuses on at key moments, and sometimes even says was central to him, right, is Christ crucified. And so one of the things we'll talk about next time is what does that mean? What connotations would that phrase have had in his time? It may be so familiar to some of you that you may not realize that Christ, the Messiah crucified, is actually something that sounds, or would have sounded in that time, almost self-contradictory. Right? It sounds like an oxymoron, right? Crucified Messiah. No, you've got to pick one or the other. It just doesn't fit. We'll talk about why next time. And Paul clearly had some particular ways of understanding the significance of the crucifixion of Jesus. And so we'll talk about that. And one other thing we'll look at is the expectation he seems to have had, and this will lay some groundwork for looking at 1 Thessalonians in particular. We sometimes get the impression in Paul's letters that he expected that he was living at the decisive final moment in history before there'd be a final judgment and the dawn of the kingdom of God. And so we'll look at that next time. But just as food for thought, go back to this map. Paul seems to, if Paul had, as some clues in his letters suggest, the expectation that he's living at the end of history, and this message needs to go out to the whole world before the final judgment, right, to prepare humankind for it, then it may be that in seeking to go from Jerusalem and via Antioch, through Asia Minor or Turkey, Greece, trying to get his way to Rome, hoping to get to Spain, maybe he's hoping to go around the whole of the Roman Empire, right? Come back along North Africa through places like Alexandria, Carthage, and Alexandria, which were also important centers. And maybe he thought that once he's accomplished that, that would see, the dawning of the kingdom of God. Does the geography of his activity give us any clues to his thoughts about the nearness of the end and other things that he sometimes talks about? We'll think about that as well. This time, wanted to get some details about the geography, the letter writing, the pre-Christian Paul. Right? And next time, we'll talk about some of the things that, again, need to be in the background even before we talk about Paul, even though the things that come later. Right? The stories in the Gospels are another thing. Right? They're only written down later. Right? It's generally agreed that Paul's letters predate even the earliest of the Gospels that are in the New Testament. There are some who have doubts about that, but most think that that's the case. And so, in focusing on Paul's letters, in one sense we could bracket out the Gospels. On the other hand, when Paul wrote these things to Christians, and he mentions Christ crucified and mentions Jesus, these people already know who he is. They'd already heard things about him. And to the extent that we can figure out what he proclaimed that led them to become Christians, what he taught them after they had done that, that might help us to understand what he's taking for granted as he writes these letters to them and expects them to understand what he's talking about. Because if we're going to read other people's mail, we're going to need to do a little extra research in order to have a better chance of understanding it. Okay, well that, I think, covers a lot of introductory stuff. I don't think there's anyone here who actually took the Bible with me, although there are some people here who may take the course on the Bible with someone else. Some of this, is already going into more detail than I go into in my course on the Bible. But some of it is review if any of you haven't made a review things to catch up for. We still have a couple minutes. Feel free to pack up, as you already do, but you might feel a bit more relaxed if you know you're doing it with permission. But any questions, comments, or observations? I know I'm hitting you with a lot. Believe me, this will not be the format, certainly after this weekend.